is that God will deliver his people who reject him. God will deliver his people who reject him. The story continues one day. So Moses is delivered by God's grace, by God's power, and then we just continue. 40 years, as we know from Acts, happens, but our story just continues as if it was a more of a natural time period flow one day. We also know from Acts that Moses learned in the schools of Egypt with a primary emphasis on writing, which is very important for us because, well, Moses wrote so much of God's word and God's wisdom. He had already been preparing him for his task and his calling. Now Moses goes out. He goes out from Pharaoh's house and he goes to his people. The word there is even his brothers. He goes out to his people. The distinction is very strong. Now, we don't know if this is unusual going out, if this is the first time Moses ever gone out of the house of Pharaoh. I doubt that's true. I assume Moses knows because he was raised by his mother in early years and he's aware of what's going on in Egypt. He knew his people were enslaved. He's not going out and just checking it out. When he goes out to see his people, he's going out with an intention to care for them. He's going out to his people to help them. He goes to see his people, and he goes into his own brothers. Now, I think there may be some allusion to Genesis 37 here. Joseph goes to his brothers and is rejected by them. I think there's a slight allusion to Genesis 37 here. The key there's a strong distinction. He goes to his brothers. And Hebrews 11 even makes this clear. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. I believe this going out is him making a distinct choice. He's going to be with his people. He's going to help his people. As he goes out, he sees them. The same word that it has in verse 25 for God seeing is the same word that Moses sees. It's not just observation. He goes out and he's looking for them. It's eyes of care and comfort. According to Acts, he goes out and he has the intent. According to Stephen's speech in Acts, he has the intent. He's going to deliver his people. And he does so by killing the Egyptian. Now, I need to make sure I'm careful with my words here. The Egyptian is striking a Hebrew. So Moses goes and he strikes down the Egyptian, and he buries him in the sand. It's very important that the word strike there is the same word that Moses used to recite the story. Verse 13, the next day. So Moses goes out of the house of Pharaoh. He strikes down an Egyptian who's oppressing his fellow Hebrew. The next day, 2 Hebrew men are struggling now. And Moses confronts the one who is the oppressor. And he says, "Why do you strike your companion?" His brother asks, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" You already hear the rejection. You already hear that they're rejecting this Moses. And the answer, of course, is, well, God made him a prince and a judge over you. But we're still not mature yet in Moses, and we're still not quite there in the story for that to be the evident truth for Israel and Moses. Notice the Hebrew says, "Are you going to kill me?" So far, this is where the language changes. Moses struck the man. The Egyptian struck the man. The Hebrew is striking the Hebrew. Now, when Moses confronts the Hebrew striking the Hebrew responds to him and says, "Are you going to kill me?" This is accusatory. He's upping the level of killing. It's accusing of murder. The striking could be just. We're going to get into that. But I believe the language changes from strike to kill because we see this Hebrew trying to deflect. Who made you a judge over me? Are you going to kill me? So he's questioning his ability to be the judge, and then he wants to undermine his authority by saying, you're the murderer. Are you going to kill me as well? When Pharaoh heard this, he was fearful. He was fearful. We see later, Pharaoh finds out. He wants to kill Moses. Again, the language has changed from striking to killing. Moses flees from his position in fear. Now, let's think about the striking. Let's go back and focus in. What does it mean that Moses struck down the Egyptian? Was this a just killing or was this a moral failure? It's hard for us, I think, with our Western minds to think the striking could ever be morally acceptable. But I think there's a lot of evidence here to not to give Moses a break necessarily, but to see that this wasn't murder necessarily. First of all, Moses could have used the word murder as he recited this. He could have condemned himself by using the same word from the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill. He could have condemned himself. Now, that's an argument from silence. I realize that's not the strongest argument. So let's look at the words again. In Exodus, we have the rule eye for eye. Lex talionis, an eye for eye morality, an eye for eye law. Whereas if you kill someone, then you should be killed. Moses wrote that in Exodus, and I believe he's using the same word, striking for the Egyptian, and striking for Moses to possibly justify this as a lex talionis, an eye for eye action. Another way we could look at this is in Exodus 12:29. God strikes down the Egyptians. It's possible Moses, being the deliverer of God, is putting himself as in the action of God. He's striking down as God himself will strike down. Now, this was all from word studies, which aren't fruitless, but I don't think they really give us a conclusion. I think the story does. The point of the story isn't Moses' moral failure in striking down this Egyptian. Moses' failure is that he flees in fear. Moses' failure is that he is afraid. He clearly feels the calling of God to be the deliverer. He wants to go out and be the deliverer. Stephen makes that very clear. He thought they would understand that he was going to be the agent by which God delivers them. His failure isn't in the killing. The focus of his failure is in his fear and in his fleeing. Of course, let's look again to Stephen. The divine commentator on this passage, the inspired commentary, shows that the storyline also points to another failure. Moses' failure was fleeing in fear. But the real emphasis of this story is on God's people rejecting God's deliverance. Acts 7, verse 23. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. Moses is going out to see them. Moses goes out to help them. And they reject him. They even betray him. How did Pharaoh know that he had killed an Egyptian? The Hebrews that were there must have told on their own deliverer. So we see the focus here is not so much on the murder, or on the killing, or the striking down. It's on the fear and the failure and the rejection. Finally, this is written for Israelites in their sojourning. This reminds them of how over and over again Israel rejected God's appointed leader, Moses. God had appointed him to be the prince and the judge, and over again Israel will be reminded they are a stiff-necked, hard-hearted people. This is meant to be a corrective against their grumbling and ours. So the conclusion from this, it leads us to see that Moses is God's appointed deliverer, and Israel has rejected him. Moses is clearly the deliverer. He goes out to save his brothers. He even saves these women from the shepherds. He has it in his DNA. God has gifted him and equipped him and built him up to be a deliverer. I believe God also wanted to send him into the wilderness to put him in a seminary of sorts. His training. Things needed to change from us. He needed to grow. And so God has set him apart for a season to grow outside of Egypt. But his fear is, or the major failure here in his being called the deliverer is in his fear. Now remember, fear is this motif that just keeps running through Exodus. The main theme is God is with his people. He's going to deliver them. He's with them to deliver them. He's with them to make them a nation. He's with them to be the place in which God is worshiped purely and rightly. But fear constantly is brought back into the storyline. And here we see the great deliverer fail because of fear. Now we also need to recognize this is written for us. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, all these things happen to be our example. As Christ said, all of the Old Testament is pointing to him. There's a great parallel here. Moses is God's deliverer for Israel at this time in the slavery of Egypt. Jesus is our deliverer today, and he delivers us from sin and evil. We can look and see some parallels. Deuteronomy 18:18, I will raise up for them a prophet like you. He's speaking to Moses there. God says, I'm going to raise up a prophet like you. There's going to be another prophet that comes after you that's actually going to be better than you. And we can see how there may be small, partial fulfillments of this as other prophets rose up. But Hebrews makes it clear. In many ways, throughout the days, God spoke to his people through his prophets. But now, he's spoken to us through his Son. The Son is the prophet of God because he declares exactly what God's truth is at all times. So we see here that Moses has been replaced by Jesus as the prophet of Israel. He is the Son who speaks to us a better word. Hebrews 3 says Jesus is greater than Moses. Moses was just simply a servant of the house who God called to lead for a season. Jesus is the Son over the house. It is his house. He is the one worthy of more glory because he is the glorious Son of God. He is the one who is without sin, which means he's able to be the perfect priest whose ministry is eternal and never ends. He's the one who's able to lay down his life as a perfect substitute, as a perfect sacrifice. So the wrath of God is poured on him instead of those who believe in him. If Moses failed by fleeing, we see the contrast in that Jesus remained faithful. Jesus feared God. He had no fear of Pontius Pilate. He had no fear of any Roman guard or any Jewish authority. He feared God. He sought to please God with his life and did so perfectly. He was the one without sin. When faced with death, he went silently as a lamb to be slain for his people. Because he knew the only way that we could live is if he died. See, Moses retreated when his people needed him. Jesus remained steadfast. He remained faithful even to the point of death. This is why Jesus is our prince. He is our prince that God has ultimately set over us. He is the Prince of Peace. He has come to make peace. Now, the problem in Exodus is that there's two nations that are at odds with one another. And the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ, will one day put all wars to end and put all people in a proper relationship with one another. He will end all wars. But as we know already today, the primary focus of what Jesus was accomplishing on the cross was to give us peace with God. God is righteous. God is perfectly good, and God is the judge who will hold us accountable for every sin. That's why he sent Jesus to be the Prince of Peace, so that the wrath of God would no longer be poured out upon us. The wrath of God would no longer be over us. He's the Prince who brings peace by dying for us. He's the one who gives us peace with God. He puts us back into a right relationship with God. He reconciles us to God by coming to be judged in our place. He dies on the cross for sinners. He will come again and he will judge sin.